Continuing my read-through of the Bible, I now come to the second part of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. So as I said in my review of Ezra, apparently the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book, up until the 9th century when they began to get split into two books. If you go on to Wikipedia, it's actually a lot more complicated than that, but I'm not going to get into all that, in part because I'm not sure I fully understand it. So, this is a continuation of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and a lot of the same things I said in my review of the book of Ezra, or my discussion of the book of Ezra, are going to hold true for this one as well, and I'm going to try to avoid repeating myself too much. But just to briefly recap, this is the exiles, Jewish exiles returning to Jerusalem from Persia. We are now fully in the age of history here instead of the age of myth. And so there is a good argument to be made that much of this is actually historical. I'll get into that in just a second. But because it's historical and not myth, stories are maybe a little bit more boring, or at the very least, not quite as memorable. I said this is in my review of Ezra as well, my discussion of Ezra, that these stories are boring, but boring isn't the right word for it, maybe. There's a lot of interesting stuff here, if you're interested in history. And because this is arguably historical documents, there can be a lot of interesting things in here if you want to really study this period. But let's start by briefly recapping the plot of Nehemiah, such as it is. So the Jewish exiles have already begun returning to Jerusalem. Nehemiah, however, is still in the court of Persia, and he is a very important position. He is the cupbearer to the king. Now, the actual text of the Bible does not linger too much on the importance of this position, but if your religious upbringing was anything like mine, you had it emphasized to you in Sunday school how important a cupbearer was. Apparently, he was the person who would taste the wine right before giving it to the king in order to kind of prevent the king from getting poisoned. Subsequently, the cupbearer was in a position of tremendous trust to the king. He was like the last person who had the opportunity to poison the king if he wanted to slip something into the king's wine. So the king and the cupbearer, so I've been told, have a very close, trusting relationship. How exactly Nehemiah came to this position isn't true. But Nehemiah is sad because he's hearing reports about how the Jewish exiles in Jerusalem still have not rebuilt the wall, and the wall around Jerusalem is still in ruins. The king asks him why he is sad. Nehemiah gets a little bit nervous before making his request to the king. So there's a little bit, I like this because it's a little bit of a human element. A great fear came over to me, and I said, blah, 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 blah. And then there's also, I called on the God of heaven and made this reply to the king. That's how it's translated in the Jerusalem Bible. The way I remember this being translated when I was reading it in the NIV growing up is that Nehemiah makes a quick little prayer quickly to God. So, those little human touches are interesting. You can see this is all in the first person here. So this is presented as if it was the memoirs of Nehemiah. Just like in the book of Ezra, we had some first-person parts, which were, I guess, the memoirs of Ezra. Here we have the memoirs of Nehemiah. So maybe this is as good a place as any as to talk about the historicity debate, historical accuracy debate about this. The impression I get is that most scholars believe that probably Nehemiah was a real historical person, and that his memoirs here are incorporated into the book of Nehemiah. Now, editors got their hands on this at some point. So Nehemiah's memoirs are chopped up and integrated with some other material, which, as in the book of Ezra, causes it to switch back and forth between the first person and the third person. And there's some lists and there's some liturgies and stuff like that. But there's reason to think that mixed in with all this is Nehemiah's actual memoir, or at least his report. So, now let me counter that here. There's a counter view to this, and I forget where I read this exactly. It was one of the books I read on the Bible. Maybe it was The Bible Tells Me So by Peter Enns. Maybe it was another book. I don't remember. But one of the counterpoints to that is that scene I just read where Nehemiah is the cupbearer and he's asking the king for a favor. Apparently, the cupbearer being in a trusted position and asking the king for a favor was a bit of a trope in the legendary material at that time, at this time. Again, I forget where I read that, but I read it somewhere. So that's, I guess, some reason why people think this is legendary, or at least that part of it is legendary. But then, once we get to Nehemiah reaching Jerusalem, it really does seem to read like a politician's actual memoirs. So he is so concerned with justifying himself, saying all the good reforms he did, saying why everyone should be thankful to him, saying why his enemies are so rotten and his enemies are a bunch of liars, and also going out of his way to say that he didn't cause the state any extra expenses and he didn't take the governor's salary because he didn't want to be a burden on the state. As always, take my opinion with a grain of salt because I'm not a scholar. But even if you're not a scholar, I think you can look at this and think, okay, this doesn't sound like legendary material. I mean, if you wanted to write legendary material, you could do better. You could make more fantastical stories or more exciting stories. This sounds like the very boring, lawyer-like, self-defensive prose of a politician. So, perhaps the beginning part is a legendary part that was added on earlier, but I'm inclined to believe, even though I'm not an expert in anything, but I'm inclined to believe that these are the historical Nehemiah's actual memoirs integrated into this, with maybe the cupbearer part being legendary. I mean, another reason to suppose that the cupbearer part would be legendary, I guess, is what experience does a cupbearer have in governing? I mean, how does a cupbearer get appointed as governor? But yeah, once he is governor here, he goes around and I mentioned in my review of Ezra that these stories are anticlimactic, either arguably because the author is intentionally setting them up as anticlimactic. That's the argument that another YouTube channel, The Bible Project, was advocating. Or perhaps they're anticlimactic just because we are outside of the age of myth now and we are in the age of history, and history can sometimes just be anticlimactic. But Nehemiah is in Jerusalem. He's got some enemies here. Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite slave. According to the footnotes, Sanballat was a governor of Samaria. Tobiah was probably an official under him. So that Ammonite slave is a little bit of a funny way of saying it. If it was really an official, I don't know if that's a slur. And they are upset that Nehemiah is there. They are suspicious of him and jealous of his powers. They don't really do much. They send a bunch of letters all over. Nothing much comes of it. Nehemiah alleges in chapter 6 that they tried to draw him into a trap by inviting him to meetings where they're planning his assassination, but he just declines the meetings, and that's the end of it. One suspects, of course, obviously, that perhaps Nehemiah is giving a somewhat biased account throughout this. There's a little bit of a sense of the lady doth protest too much throughout all his defenses of himself. I guess the one thing that is kind of exciting is at one point there's rumors that there are going to be attacks on the Israelites who are working on the walls. And so the Israelites break off into two groups. One group is guarding the builders of the wall. And even the people who are building the wall are working with a sword in one hand and doing the building with the other hand. But nothing comes of it. There is no actual attack. There are rumors of attack, but apparently they get the warning early enough. So yeah, I said in my review of the book of Ezra, the stories of Ezra and Nehemiah aren't really memorable in the way that David and Goliath or Joshua and Jericho are really memorable, because they're a lot less fantastical. But again, if you're interested in history, it is fascinating to think that here we are, separated by some 2,500 years from this period, which feels like it's from another world. The world of the Persians and the ancient Israelites, and here we have a voice, an authentic voice from that time that we can read, and even though it does seem to be a biased and self-serving account, we can get a sense of a voice talking to us from the past. So that's interesting. But I'll tell you what's not interesting is all the lists and lists of names that are going all the way through this. So we got the volunteer builders, and then we've got to list them all. And then later we have a list of the exiles to return. And then we've got a list of them all. And then over here, records of the promises made by the community, lists of names, the repopulation policy of Nehemiah, more lists of names. So, yeah, I know. What did you expect reading through the Bible? The Bible is famous for its chronologies, right? So-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. But I think, if I may, I think these lists are even more boring than some of the other lists. Because when you're reading through like the first 9 chapters of First Chronicles or something, that's a genealogy of largely important names in the Israelite story, right? It's boring to read through them in genealogy fashion, but as you read through, you recognize the names, you realize that these are important figures. Here, these are names of people who I don't think we know anything else about them, just aside from their names and the fact that they appear in the lists. And again, because this is arguably real, authentic historical material, I guess maybe these were real lists with real names on them. But still boring to read through. I was listening to one commentary on this, and I'll try and remember to leave a link to it below, that indicated that the numbers in some of these lists were quite different from scroll to scroll. So, the surviving scrolls we have of the oldest surviving documents here, the numbers vary a lot, which appears to be just a lot of scribal errors copying the scrolls, although there are different theories on that. I'll link to his video. You can give it a listen for yourself. Okay, Some interesting stuff here and some boring stuff as well. Then we get Ezra reads the law. So, okay, crossover alert. Here's Ezra from the book of Ezra. Although, again, remember historically, I guess this was all Ezra and Nehemiah were all one book. Here we're switching into the third person again. So this is a break from Nehemiah's memoirs. For that and for other reasons, there's some conjecture that maybe this part was originally earlier in the Ezra part and got moved over here when the editors were making a mess out of this material. Some people, like Robin Lane Fox, believes that the editors made a bit of a mess chopping everything up when they were putting this all together. I'm not really qualified to say, of course. You can see that the Jerusalem Bible has this as Judaism is born. So I guess maybe this is the moment where Judaism, as we know it, is starting to come into being. They also do footnote this. They say this gloss makes the gathering resemble the liturgical penitential gatherings of the chronicler's own day. So the chronicler is whoever put together 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah. There's a theory that it was all the same guy. And I guess what we mean by put together is edited it together. So he had maybe access to the memoirs of Ezra, and he had access to the memoirs of Nehemiah, and he put them all together. So this footnote makes it sound like the chronicler was working sometime afterwards. I don't know what the theory on that is. Okay. So, and once we get through the lists of the repopulation, then we get to the dedication of the wall, the golden age, and then the second mission of Nehemiah. Now, this is, again, where we get into some of the disturbing racial purity stuff. I mentioned this, it was at the end of the book of Ezra, and now here it's at the end of the book of Nehemiah. So they're reading from the book of Moses, and they come to the part where it says, "The Ammonite and the Moabite shall never be admitted to the assembly of God, since they did not come to meet the sons of Israel with bread and water. They hired Balaam against them to curse them, but our God turned the curse into the blessing." The footnote from the Jerusalem Bible indicates that apparently this is a rather free quotation from Deuteronomy 23 and Numbers 22. I actually didn't go back and look at that, but I'm taking this to mean that this is not the exact words of Deuteronomy 23. It seems to be maybe a paraphrase of it. So we don't want any Ammonites or Moabites mixing their blood in with the Jews. And this is the second mission of Nehemiah. Now, there's a few things going on here. He finds that they're not keeping the Sabbath, so he's enforces them to keep the Sabbath. But then we get to the racial purity stuff here. At that time, I again saw Jews who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As regards their children, half of them spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples, but could not speak the language of Judah. I reprimanded them and called down curses on them. I struck several of them and tore out their hair and made them swear by God. I guess this is where it's getting a little bit violent. At the end of the book of Ezra, there was not quite this violence. It seemed like everybody agreed with Ezra and did it voluntarily. Here it looks like Nehemiah is lashing out and assaulting people. Although, the commentary on this I mentioned earlier is hypothesizing that we actually shouldn't imagine Nehemiah doing this himself. For one reason, I guess he would have been quite elderly by this time. Rather, the interpretation is supposed to be that Nehemiah ordered this to be done to them. So these were lawful punishments that Nehemiah, what's the word when you give someone a punishment? Nehemiah ordered those punishments to be done to them. What's the word I'm looking for? Nehemiah ordered the punishments to be done to them. I don't know. To me, it certainly sounds like, when you read this, Nehemiah himself is striking them and tearing out their hair. I mean, take me with a grain of salt. I don't know anything. I'm not a scholar, but that's what it sounds like to me. Like Nehemiah is doing it himself. And then he, foreign women were the cause of sin. So he one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Elishab, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Hornite. I expelled him from my presence. Blah, 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 blah. Again, this, I think in light of the disturbing results that emphasis on racial purity have had in the 20th century, we read this now with a bit of cringe. But again, I'm going to repeat this once again. I know I said it in a couple of videos, but I find this interesting. Christine Hayes, in her lectures on the Old Testament, puts forth the theory that apparently some people have, that the book of Ruth was written around this time as a direct response to this racial purity. So you can see it here, that the Moabites come in a couple times. The Moabites never to be admitted to the assembly of God. They're a cursed people. And over here, Ammon and Moab. So Nehemiah is apparently assaulting people who have a Moabite wife. But then if you go back and you read the story of Ruth, the narrator of the book of Ruth goes out of their way to make you never forget that Ruth was a Moabite. It keeps saying Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, constantly emphasizing that over and over again. So it's not something that the author of Ruth wants you to forget about or is trying to slip past you, going out of their way to draw attention to the fact that, yes, Ruth is a Moabite. So I like the theory that the book of Ruth was written around this time, and this would be another example of, I guess, divergent views within Judaism that both made their way into the Bible. So isn't that interesting to think about? But lest I be too hard on Nehemiah, there are things to like about him. So he does his best to vindicate the social problems of the time. So he comes and he finds that the people are in poverty because of predatory lending. So we are having to mortgage our fields and our vineyards to our houses to get corn from the famine. We've had to borrow money on our fields and our vineyards to pay the king's tax. And the people who are doing this are other Jews, right? Though we are the same flesh as our brothers, and our children are as good as theirs, we are having to sell our sons and daughters into slavery. I guess this happened at various periods in history. Maybe it still happens in some areas of the world now, but it's really horrific to think about parents being in that situation, huh? Nehemiah is not happy about this. When I heard their complaints in these words, I was very angry. So I reprimanded the authorities and officials. What a burden you impose, I said. Every one of you on his brother. Summoning a great assembly to deal with them, I said to them, to the best of our powers we have redeemed our brother Jews who had been sold to foreigners, And now you in turn are selling our brothers for us to redeem them." They were silent and could find nothing to say. "What are you doing?" I went on. Sorry. "What you are doing," I went on, "is wrong. Do you not want to walk in the fear of God and escape the sneers of the nations and enemies? I too, my kinsmen and my servants, have lent them money and corn. Let us cancel this debt. Return them their fields, their vineyards, their olive groves, and their houses forthwith, and remit the debt on the money, corn, wine, and oil, which you have lent them." So, imagine that happening today, right? With all the debt crisis that's going on, or the mortgage crisis that was going on, especially in 2008, with all these American families just crushed by debt. And then Nehemiah comes in, he says, let's just cancel the debt. And surprisingly enough, they agree. "We will make restitution," they replied. "We will claim nothing more from them. We will do as you say." Well, that was easy. Again, this comes back to the suspicion I was voicing earlier, where Nehemiah is maybe writing these memos up in a self-justifying way. Maybe it didn't go down exactly like this. Maybe he didn't succeed in getting all the debts canceled for the poor people. It sounds like a little bit too easy, right? To just get all the rich people in one room and say, "What are you guys doing? Cancel those debts." And they say, "Oh, okay." And again, not to get too political here, but imagine this happening in today's America, right? Of course, this never happens. We bail out the banks, but we don't cancel the debts of ordinary people. I don't know. I really shouldn't opine too much on this because I don't know anything about anything. I've heard it said that in the ancient world, debt cancellation or debt forgiveness was much more common because it was a way of restarting the economy. You would get to a point where so many people would be in so much debt that in order to get the economy moving again, periodically governments would just cancel the debts. I heard that on one of History Civilius's videos. I'll actually see if I can track that down and put a link to that video in the description down below, so you know what I'm talking about. It could be that in the ancient world it was just much more common than it is today, which might mean the situations are not comparable. Anyways, I think I'm going to wrap things up here. That's all for the book of Nehemiah. And next, I am on to Tobit, Judith, and Esther next. That should be some interesting reading, huh? And I will report back as I finish each book.